It was the kind of cold that bit through layers of fabric and skin alike, the kind of night where even silence felt heavy. The snow-covered back road outside Lincoln, New Hampshire, was desolate, with only the faint orange flicker of a broken street light cutting through the darkness. At 11:48 p.m., a car sat half buried in snow at a sharp bend along Route 112. Its headlights were still on. Steam rose from the cracked hood. And inside, on the driver's seat, lay an empty purse, an old student ID, and a faint trace of blood on the steering wheel. The driver, Emily Hartwell, 22 years old, a psychology major at Northridge College, was nowhere to be found. When the first responding officer arrived, he described the scene as too quiet to be real. There were no footprints leading away from the car, no sign of struggle, no tire marks suggesting another vehicle. Just that eerie stillness, broken only by the hum of the idling engine and the distant whisper of the wind through the pine trees. What puzzled investigators most wasn't the crash itself. Minor accidents were common on that icy road, but the disappearance that followed. Emily had called her roommate barely 15 minutes earlier, saying she'd be home in half an hour. She never arrived. By morning, news of her disappearance had spread across the small New Hampshire town like wildfire. Neighbors remembered her as quiet but kind. Her professors called her one of the brightest minds in the department. Yet, behind that warm smile, there were whispers about sleepless nights, anxiety, and a mysterious breakup that no one quite understood. By the second day, search teams combed through miles of forest. They found nothing. Not a single trace. The only lead came from a retired truck driver, Gary Leland, who told police he saw a young woman walking along the roadside that same night, barefoot, without a coat, her hair loose and frozen in the wind. He assumed she was a hitchhiker, until he saw the look on her face, fear. When he slowed down to ask if she needed help, she darted into the woods. But even that witness couldn't confirm if it was Emily. Weeks turned into months. Posters faded. The town moved on. Yet for Emily's family, time stopped the moment she vanished. Her mother, Caroline Hartwell, refused to believe her daughter was gone. Every year, on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, she placed a candle by the crash site, her quiet protest against forgetting. Then, 20 years later, the candlelight finally flickered toward something new. In 2024, a cold case unit reopened the Hartwell disappearance, led by Detective Mark Hensley, a man known for solving the unsolvable. Technology had evolved. New DNA kits, enhanced satellite mapping, and thermal imaging now allowed old evidence to speak again. And that's when a breakthrough happened. Inside an evidence box that had sat untouched since 2004, technicians discovered a small, overlooked item, a single torn piece of cloth caught in the hinge of Emily's car door. Modern testing revealed something chilling. It wasn't Emily's blood. It belonged to an unknown male, never catalogued in any database. The revelation sent ripples through the investigative team. For 2 decades, everyone believed Emily had wandered off into the forest, disoriented and lost. But this discovery painted a darker picture. Someone else had been with her that night. Someone who didn't want her found. Detective Hensley began to reconstruct Emily's final hours. The timeline, once fragmented, now began to take shape. That evening, she had left a study session early, telling friends she wasn't feeling well. Her last phone signal pinged near a rest stop about 3 miles from the crash site, a location notorious for poor lighting and sparse traffic. From there, the trail vanished. Until the cloth appeared. What happened next would shatter the quiet image of Lincoln forever. A small town built on trust and familiarity suddenly became a map of secrets. Residents who had lived peacefully for years began recalling fragments, strange noises in the woods, an unfamiliar pickup truck seen idling near Route 112, a neighbor who abruptly moved away months after the incident. The town's calm began to fracture. And beneath it all, a chilling realization grew. Whoever was with Emily that night might still be living among them. When Detective Mark Hensley took over the Hartwell case, he wasn't chasing ghosts. He was chasing a pattern. For 20 years, he had studied missing person cases that bore uncanny similarities. A single woman, late at night, a remote area, and an unexplained disappearance following a minor car accident. But in all those cases, one detail connected them like an invisible thread. Traces of male DNA never matched in any database. Emily's case was the fourth. Hensley started from the beginning. He revisited the crash site, though most of it had been reclaimed by nature. The snow had long melted into grass, and the road was now freshly paved. Yet, when he stood there in the silence, he said it felt as if the forest itself remembered. The trees stood motionless, the air unusually still, a ghostly echo of that cold February night in 2004. He crouched beside the guardrail and imagined her car spinning, headlights cutting through the dark, the tires screeching before the crash. He whispered, "Where did you go, Emily?" That question became his obsession. He reopened the original case files. Inside were over 200 pages, interviews, phone records, maps, and hundreds of tips that went nowhere. But what caught his attention were two names barely mentioned in the initial report: Chris Monroe, a fellow student and Emily's ex-boyfriend, and Jack Tanner, a local mechanic who was the first civilian on the scene before the police arrived. Back then, Tanner's statement seemed straightforward. He claimed he saw the crashed vehicle while driving home and called it in. He said the car was empty when he arrived. But one small discrepancy bothered Hensley: the time. Tanner claimed he saw the car at 11:32 p.m. The 911 call, however, wasn't made until 11:48 p.m. So what was he doing for 16 minutes? Hensley decided to pay him a visit. Jack Tanner was now in his late 50s, running a small auto shop just outside town. The man looked uneasy the moment Hensley introduced himself. "It's been 20 years, detective. You think I still remember?" Tanner said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "I think you remember exactly what happened," Hensley replied calmly. "You were the last person to see that car before it became a crime scene." For a moment, Tanner said nothing. His eyes darted toward the back of the shop, where the hum of an old compressor filled the air. Then he muttered, "I didn't touch her car." "I never said you did," Hensley replied, watching him closely. It wasn't much, but the defensive tone told him everything. Later that night, Hensley reviewed archived police photos of the scene. He noticed something odd: faint footprints in the snow, partially erased but visible near the driver's door. They were larger than Emily's shoe size. And yet, no record mentioned collecting them. It was a small-town oversight that had cost years. He took the photos to the lab. Using digital reconstruction, analysts enhanced the image and found a distinct boot pattern. It matched a model manufactured in 2003, sold in only 14 stores across the Northeast. One of those stores was located in Lincoln. Hensley pulled old credit card records from the store archives. Only 4 people had bought that specific boot in 2003. One of them was Jack Tanner. The detective's pulse quickened. He returned to Tanner's shop the next morning with a warrant. When they searched the premises, tucked away behind a stack of tires was an old blue tarp, and beneath it, a rusted metal toolbox. Inside, sealed in a cracked plastic bag, was a woman's bracelet with the initials EH engraved on the clasp. Emily Hartwell. Tanner was arrested that afternoon. But even as officers led him away, he said one thing that haunted Hensley for days: she wasn't supposed to die. "I just wanted to talk to her." The confession wasn't full, but it was enough. Under interrogation, Tanner explained that he had known Emily from town and had been watching out for her after her breakup with Chris Monroe. He claimed he saw her car crash and stopped to help. When she panicked, he tried to calm her down, but things got out of hand. But when asked where her body was, Tanner simply stared at the floor and said, "I never found her again." That single line reopened a deeper mystery. If Tanner was telling the truth, if Emily ran into the woods that night, how could she have vanished without a trace? And why was his blood on her car door? Hensley began to suspect there was more than one person involved. The timeline started to widen again. Phone logs showed that around 11:20 p.m., Emily had received a call from an unknown prepaid number. That number, when traced, connected to another cold case file, an unsolved disappearance from 2001, only 30 miles away. 2 cases. 3 years apart. One pattern. The detective's wall was soon covered in photos, maps, and lines of red string connecting names, faces, and locations. It looked chaotic, but to Hensley, it was a web, and at the center sat something far more disturbing than a single accident. Someone had been hunting vulnerable women across New England, using the same setup every time: a remote road, a staged crash, a false offer of help. And Emily's case was the one that cracked the pattern open. Still, without a body, the district attorney couldn't press for a full murder conviction. Tanner was charged with obstruction, tampering with evidence, and involuntary manslaughter, but the truth felt unfinished. Hensley wasn't satisfied. He wanted answers. So, in late 2024, he initiated one final search, a focused dig along the frozen ravine just half a mile from where Emily's car was found. Cadaver dogs, drones, and 3D radar scanners swept the terrain. And on the 3rd day, the dogs stopped. Under a shallow layer of soil, preserved by the cold, they found remains, skeletal fragments, a torn jacket, and a rusted locket. The engraving on it read, "Love, Mom." DNA confirmed it. Emily Hartwell had finally been found. The discovery of Emily Hartwell's remains changed everything. For 20 years, her name had lingered in cold case archives like a whisper, a ghost of unanswered questions. But now, the forest that had swallowed her secret finally spoke. Detective Mark Hensley stood at the excavation site as the evidence team worked quietly under the dull morning light. The air was sharp, and frost clung to the edges of their gloves. The locket, once silver, had darkened with time. Inside it was a faded photo, a little girl on her mother's lap, both smiling into a world that had no idea how cruel it could be. That photo hit Hensley harder than he expected. He thought of his own daughter, now in college, the same age Emily had been when she vanished. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, and promised himself this would end here. No more unanswered ghosts. Within hours, the medical examiner confirmed fractures in the skull consistent with blunt force trauma. Emily had been struck, not killed by the crash, but by someone she trusted. And then something else surfaced, a fragment of fabric clinging to her torn jacket. Under forensic testing, it revealed a second DNA profile. Not Tanner's. Someone else had been there. When Hensley received the results, he froze. The unknown DNA belonged to a male relative of Chris Monroe, Emily's ex-boyfriend. Chris had left New Hampshire after the investigation collapsed years ago. He was living in Maine now, working as a long-haul truck driver. Hensley's instinct screamed that it was time to pay him a visit. It was late evening when he arrived at a rundown truck depot on the outskirts of Portland. The sound of engines echoed across the lot as the sun sank behind the trees. Chris was there, leaning against his rig, cigarette in hand. He didn't look surprised to see the detective. "You've been digging," Chris said flatly. "Trying to find the truth," Hensley replied. "You were close to Emily. You know more than you told the police back then." Chris's eyes darkened. "She left me, detective. That's all I know." "But you followed her that night," Hensley countered. "You called her from a burner phone. The records prove it." A long silence stretched between them. The wind hissed through the power lines. Then Chris flicked his cigarette and said, "You think I killed her?" "I think you were there," Hensley said. "And I think Jack Tanner wasn't acting alone." The look on Chris's face shifted, a twitch in the jaw, a sudden glance away. That was all the confirmation Hensley needed. He pushed further. "Tanner said he didn't mean for her to die. He said she ran into the woods. But you were already there, weren't you? You found her before he could." Chris's voice broke slightly. "You don't know what she did to me." "What she did to you?" Hensley snapped. "She was a 19-year-old kid trying to start over." Chris's hands trembled. "You don't understand. She was going to tell everyone what I did. I couldn't let her." The words hung heavy in the air, then died in his throat. He realized what he had just said. Hensley stepped closer. "Tell everyone what? That you heard her before? That you stalked her?" Chris didn't answer. But his silence was its own confession. That night, police obtained a warrant to search his home. Inside a locked cabinet in his garage, they found a box, old photos, letters from Emily, and a single Polaroid showing her car half buried in snow, headlights still on. Taken from a distance. The timestamp read February 9, 2004, 11:39 p.m. The exact time between the crash and the 911 call. When the trial began in early 2025, it became one of New Hampshire's most watched proceedings. 2 men, 1 deceased woman, and 20 years of silence unraveled in front of a nation hungry for closure. Tanner, desperate to avoid a life sentence, took the stand first. His voice trembled as he recounted that night. "I stopped because the car looked wrecked," he said. "I thought she was hurt." Then Chris showed up out of nowhere. He was angry, yelling at her. "I told him to calm down, but..." "But he didn't," the prosecutor interrupted. Tanner nodded slowly. "He hit her. She fell. I panicked. I didn't think she was dead. Chris said he'd handle it. Told me to leave, or I'd regret it. So, I did." Every word pierced the courtroom like glass. Across the aisle, Chris sat motionless, jaw clenched, eyes hollow. When his turn came to testify, his lawyer advised against it. But he insisted. "I didn't mean to kill her," he said, voice shaking. "It was an accident. She fell, hit her head on the rock. I tried to wake her up." "And then you buried her?" the prosecutor asked coldly. Chris hesitated. "I thought if no one found her, no one would know." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, journalists scribbling, cameras clicking. At that moment, Emily's mother, seated in the front row, began to weep silently. She had waited 2 decades for this, for the truth to be spoken aloud. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts. Chris Monroe was sentenced to life without parole. Jack Tanner received a reduced sentence for cooperation, but his freedom was gone all the same. As the judge read the final decision, Hensley watched from the back row. Justice had been served, but the feeling wasn't victory. It was something deeper, quieter. Like closing a book you never wanted to open in the first place. Later that evening, he visited the spot where Emily had been found. The snow was falling again, soft, clean, erasing footprints as they formed. He placed the locket gently on the ground and whispered, "You can rest now." For the first time in years, the woods were silent in peace, not in hiding. And as he walked away, he thought about the countless other names still trapped in cold files across the country. Each one waiting for someone to listen. Someone to dig deep enough. Someone to care. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't die. It just waits for the right detective to find it. The town of Lincoln, New Hampshire, hadn't known real peace since 2004. For 2 decades, the case of Emily Hartwell was the shadow behind every whisper, every half-remembered rumor, every uneasy silence at town gatherings. When the verdict was read, something shifted. It wasn't celebration, no one clapped, no one cheered, but the weight in the air felt different. Lighter, maybe. The kind of lightness that comes not from joy, but from release. Emily's mother, now frail and gray-haired, stood outside the courthouse surrounded by reporters. Her hands trembled as she held a folded photo of Emily, the same one police had used on the original missing posters. The flash of cameras lit her face, but she didn't look at them. She looked at the sky instead, her lips moving softly in prayer. Later, she told a journalist, "I always believed she'd come home one day. I just never imagined it would be this way. But at least I can sleep knowing the truth found its way back." Detective Mark Hensley stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, listening quietly. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't smile for cameras. He'd done his job, but the job had changed him. He knew that finding truth didn't erase the years of pain it had left behind. A few weeks after the sentencing, the Hartwell home became a small shrine. Locals began leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes on the porch. Some had known Emily personally. Others hadn't, but they came anyway. There was something universal about her story, the way innocence could vanish and haunt a whole community. One letter stood out. It was written in a child's handwriting. "Dear Emily, my mom says you're in heaven now. I hope the stars are nice there." Hensley read that note when he stopped by the house to return the locket. The old woman took it in her hands and wept. Not loudly, not theatrically, but the kind of cry that shakes the years loose. He didn't say a word. There wasn't anything left to say. Across town, the case had inspired something unexpected. The local sheriff's department reopened 3 other cold cases from the early 2000s. One of them, a missing hiker from 2006, bore eerie similarities to Emily's disappearance. Forensic DNA preservation techniques had advanced so much that new testing could be done on evidence once considered useless. It was as if Emily's case had become a key, unlocking the doors to others long thought sealed shut. News of the case spread beyond New Hampshire. True crime podcasts, documentaries, and investigative journalists began covering it in depth. Some criticized how law enforcement had failed Emily early on. Others focused on the perseverance that finally brought her home. But to Hensley, it wasn't about media or glory. It was about voices, the ones buried under time, under fear, under paperwork and indifference. Every victim deserved to be heard, even if the world had stopped listening. He found himself visiting the site again one night in early spring. The snow was gone now, replaced by soft moss and tiny blue wildflowers. The trees whispered in the wind, and the faint smell of pine filled the air. He stood there for a long while before saying quietly, "We heard you, Emily. You weren't forgotten." In that moment, something inside him eased. 4 years, he had been chasing ghosts, faces in old photos, names on yellowed files, but now he understood, these stories weren't about death. They were about remembrance. About giving names back to the nameless, light back to the lost. That night, as he drove away from Lincoln, the radio played softly. A news anchor's voice mentioned another cold case reopened in Massachusetts, a young woman missing since 1999. Hensley turned up the volume. Maybe, he thought, this was the real legacy of Emily Hartwell. That her truth had reignited the will to search for others. That her silence had become a voice loud enough to wake the forgotten. When he got home, he placed Emily's file on his shelf, beside the others. But unlike them, Hers bore a single red label across the front: closed, justice served. He turned off the light, the room dim except for the sliver of moonlight cutting across the files. They seemed to breathe in the dark, waiting, whispering, reminding him that his work wasn't done. Because justice might close a file, but it never closes the human heart. And for every mystery that finds its ending, another begins, somewhere out there in the dark. Long after the headlines faded, long after the reporters packed up their cameras and the courthouse returned to stillness, the story of Emily Hartwell lived on, not as tragedy, but as testimony. The town of Lincoln eventually built a small memorial garden on the edge of the forest where she was last seen. Just a simple bench, a plaque, and a pathway lined with white stones. Her name was engraved beneath the words, "Truth never dies. It waits." Sometimes, at dusk, people said they could hear wind chimes echo faintly from the trees, though none had ever been hung there. Others said it was just the wind through the branches. But for those who had followed her story, it was something else entirely. It was memory. It was voice. Detective Hensley retired 2 years later. He didn't take souvenirs or medals, only one thing sat on his desk as he cleared it, a note Emily's mother had written: "Thank you for listening when no one else did." He kept that note in his wallet, folded and worn at the edges. He said it reminded him why he'd started. Why he couldn't walk away from the past, because the past was never truly gone, it was just waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And that's what Mystery Files is all about, listening to the silences history left behind. In a world obsessed with headlines and closure, it's easy to forget the quiet truths buried beneath. But every cold case isn't just a mystery, it's a message. Every name lost in the dark still whispers for light. Emily's case wasn't just about who took her, it was about what she gave back: courage, awareness, a spark of justice that reignited a movement across states. She reminded the world that even the faintest trace of truth can pierce through decades of silence. And that's the heartbeat of every story we tell here, not about death, but about voices that refuse to die. Because in the end, every mystery leaves behind a voice, and today, we've heard it. The justice that came for Emily Hartwell wasn't loud. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic courtroom scenes. It arrived quietly, like dawn after a storm. The man responsible, a former teacher who'd lived unnoticed in another state for years, was finally caught through a fragment of DNA, recovered from the old scarf found in the woods. Time had erased his confidence but not his trace. When confronted, he didn't fight. He only said one thing before being led away: "I thought they forgot her." But they hadn't. Not the detectives. Not her family. Not the countless strangers who shared her story online after the case reopened in 2024. Every click, every post, every conversation, it all became part of the collective demand for justice. Humanity, united by empathy, brought closure where silence had once ruled. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Emily's mother whispered through tears, "She can rest now." And for the first time in 2 decades, peace returned to that small New Hampshire town. Years later, local students began an annual Voice for the Vanished walk in her memory. The path begins at Lincoln High, winds through the woods, and ends at the memorial bench where her plaque rests. Along the trail, wooden signs bear the names of other missing souls, cases still waiting to be solved. It's become more than remembrance. It's a promise. Because justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration, restoring truth, dignity, and humanity to the forgotten. And so, as the screen fades to black, we're reminded once more of what drives every episode, every investigation, every whisper through the dark. That no matter how long it takes, every mystery deserves a voice. This was Mystery Files, Cold Case Investigations, where every mystery finds its truth.